stunt guys came up to me. I was just getting to know them a little bit. We're out in the country.
Kevin Costner has always looked like the kind of man life could not break. The calm jawline, the steady eyes, the voice that could hold both thunder and tenderness in the same breath. To millions, he is the eternal guardian of American cinema, the stoic protector in The Bodyguard, the dreamer who heard whispers in a cornfield in Field of Dreams, the fearless storyteller who reshaped Hollywood with Dances with Wolves. He did not inherit a kingdom of fame. He built it with calloused hands, quiet faith, and the stubborn belief that stories could save people. But behind the iconic silhouette lies a truth the spotlight never illuminated. A truth carved from the shadows of childhood grief, the fractures of love lost, and the wounds left by 2 broken marriages. A man with 7 children from 3 women, carrying the invisible cost of fame that never stops demanding, never stops taking. He learned early that applause is loud, but silence afterward is louder. He learned that success can win the world, yet failed to protect a home. And now, at 70, as age sharpens every memory and every regret, the storm returns, darker, closer, and more merciless than all the heartbreaks that came before. Because Kevin Costner is not just the architect of Hollywood's most cherished emotions. He is a man who has bled quietly behind closed doors, a man whose strength was forged not in triumph, but in the quiet rooms where sorrow teaches its bitter lessons. If Kevin Costner has ever moved you through a role, a line, or a glance that felt too real to be acting, stay. His story is not just a rise to greatness, it is the price he paid to get there. He was born into a house that had more silence than walls. On January 18, 1955, in the dusty sprawl of Linwood, California, Kevin Michael Costner entered a world built not on privilege, but on work boots, weary hands, and dreams that rarely made it past the kitchen table. His father, William Bill Costner, began as a ditch digger, a man who carved his living from the stubborn earth before rising to become a power line technician. The smell of oil and metal clung to him the way hope clings to the poor. His boots were always coated in the color of the land he worked. His knuckles carried the story of every job he refused to quit. His mother, Sharon Ray, was a quiet force of kindness, a social worker with tired eyes and a heart that had learned too much about the world's sorrows. She came home each night carrying the emotional weight of strangers, yet still managed to hum soft melodies while standing over a stove that hissed more than it burned. Love in the Costner household never needed to be spoken. It was tucked into small gestures, the careful passing of plates, the lingering looks that said, "We're here, we're together. That has to be enough." But long before Kevin took his first breath, grief had already soaked into the wood of their home. 2 years before he was born, in 1953, his middle brother, Mark Douglas, lived for a single day before his tiny heart stopped beating. It was the kind of loss that didn't rip the family apart in noise. It hollowed them out in silence. From that day forward, love in the Costner family became fierce, protective, almost desperate. Bill held everything tighter. Sharon became gentler but quieter, as if afraid that too much joy might tempt fate to take something else away. Sometimes, when Kevin was small, he would wander into the kitchen and find his mother standing perfectly still, her eyes fixed on an empty corner of the room. A look that held both the ghost of a child she never got to raise and the fear that life could be cruel enough to take another one. His father, in those moments, would grip the edge of the table as if holding the family together by sheer force of will. Kevin grew up breathing that silence, and the family moved, constantly, endlessly. Compton, Ventura, Visalia, Orange County. Always chasing work, always starting over, always learning to say goodbye before ever learning how to belong. By the time he was 12, he had packed more boxes than most adults do in a lifetime. The sound of tape tearing across cardboard became the soundtrack of his childhood. In classrooms, he was the boy teachers overlooked, quiet, gentle, always shrinking into the back row. He wasn't loud, wasn't athletic, wasn't the kind of kid who demanded attention. Instead, he wrote poems in the margins of notebooks. He sang in church choirs with a voice that trembled, not from fear but from longing. He dreamed of places that didn't move beneath his feet. Places where you could plant something, a life, a dream, a sense of self, and trust it would still be there in the morning. One night, as another moving truck pulled away, Kevin sat in the backseat of the family car, watching streetlights flicker past like memories he wasn't allowed to keep. He didn't cry. He just whispered a quiet farewell to a town that never really knew him. Childhood can be cruel in its own way. It teaches you how to lose before you ever learn how to love. But somewhere in that ache, something unshakable took root. Every silence sharpened him. Every goodbye carved strength into his bones. Every new beginning taught him that life doesn't owe you comfort. It only offers the chance to begin again. And in that constant uprooting, Kevin Costner began to understand the invisible language of human sorrow, the very language he would one day use to move the world. By the time Kevin Costner stepped into adulthood, he had already mastered the art of beginning again. He had learned it through every move, every farewell, every unfinished friendship left behind on roads he would never drive again. That quiet resilience, born in the shifting landscapes of his youth, became the compass that guided him toward a dream no one around him dared to imagine. He didn't enter his 20s with confidence or certainty. He entered with love and pressure. He married young, carrying both hope and fear in equal measure. A new wife, a tiny apartment, bills stacked like accusations on the kitchen counter. Life was tight, money was scarce, and the world seemed determined to remind him that dreams were luxuries working men could not afford. He tried to be practical. He tried to be steady, but the more he forced himself into the shape the world expected, the more restless he became. He worked any job he could find, building shelves, driving trucks, doing marketing work that drained him dry. But every day, on his commute home, he felt a quiet truth pressing against his ribs, the haunting sense that he was meant for something different, something larger, something that asked him to bleed and create and risk. Then came the moment that changed everything. On a small airplane heading back to California, Kevin Costner found himself sitting behind Richard Burton, a legend whose life had burned brighter and wilder than any star. Kevin wasn't bold enough to speak to him, but Burton, sensing something in the young man's gaze, turned and said words that would split Kevin's life into before and after. "You have to follow the dream, lad. You have to chase it." It wasn't a poetic speech. It wasn't a prophecy. It was a simple truth, spoken by someone who had lived long enough to know what regret feels like. And Kevin listened. He went home, looked at the life he had tried so hard to make fit, and realized it was too small for the heart beating inside him. With almost no money, no connections, and nothing resembling a safety net, he decided to risk everything. He quit the stable path. He walked into acting classes with a mixture of terror and faith. And he began again. This time, not because life forced him to, but because he chose it. The early years were brutal. Casting directors dismissed him, agents ignored him, producers barely looked up when he walked into a room. He took jobs no one else wanted, background roles, non-speaking parts, anything that let him stay close to the dream. There were nights he stared at the ceiling, wondering if he had ruined his future. Days when the mailbox held more rejection letters than bills. Moments when even the people who loved him began to doubt. But Costner had been forged in silence. Rejection was familiar. Restlessness was normal. Starting over was second nature. And so he kept showing up. He practiced until his voice steadied. He trained until his presence sharpened. He learned to carry sorrow in his eyes, the same sorrow he had watched in his mother's gaze. And that emotion became the quiet weapon that set him apart. Little by little, the world began to notice. A small role here, a brief appearance there. Tiny cracks in the wall between him and Hollywood. None of it was enough to call success, but it was enough to keep going. Enough to believe that maybe Richard Burton had seen something real. Enough to feel the first tremors of a destiny waking up. Kevin Costner didn't rise because lightning struck. He rose because he endured the darkness long enough to find the door.
Hollywood did not open its gates for Kevin Costner. He broke them open, with patience, grit, and the quiet fire that had been smoldering inside him since childhood. The shift began as a whisper, a small role in the big chill that was ultimately cut from the final film. Yet even in absence, something about Kevin lingered in the minds of those who saw him work. There was a steadiness in him, a presence that didn't need dialogue to speak. Directors began to notice the man with the calm eyes and the unspoken gravity, the actor who seemed to carry entire histories in a single pause. Then the whisper grew into a voice. Silverado arrived, a Western revival that allowed Kevin to step out of the shadows. He wasn't the biggest star in the film, but he moved with the effortless charm of someone who belonged on the horizon of a mythic American landscape. Audiences leaned in, Hollywood leaned closer, and then everything ignited. The Untouchables turned him into a force. Bull Durham turned him into a star. Field of Dreams turned him into a legend. In Field of Dreams, Kevin was not acting. He was living. Every quiet ache in his performance came from a boy who grew up whispering goodbye to places, people, moments he was not allowed to keep. When he stood in that ghost-lit cornfield and asked, "Dad, you want to have a catch?" the world felt something break open inside them. A soft place they had forgotten was still alive. But the summit was yet to come. In 1990, Kevin Costner did the unthinkable. He directed, produced, and starred in a film Hollywood believed would fail, a 3-hour frontier epic spoken partly in Lakota, led by an actor who refused to water down the truth. Dances with Wolves was not just a movie. It was a tectonic shift. 7 Academy Awards, a cultural reckoning, a film that gave a voice to stories America had ignored for generations. Kevin didn't just act in it, he carved it from his soul. He built a world with patience, respect, and a belief in human dignity that echoed far beyond the screen. Overnight, he was no longer just a star. He was the architect of a new cinematic language, one that valued stillness over spectacle, humanity over noise. Hollywood crowned him the last great American hero. The media called him the man who carried the heart of a nation. Fans saw him as the embodiment of integrity on screen. At the height of his reign, Kevin Costner was everywhere. Magazine covers, award stages, box office headlines. He had become the rarest of Hollywood figures, a leading man whose vulnerability was as powerful as his strength. The world adored him not because he shone brightly, but because he shone honestly. And yet, even at the peak, a shadow followed him, the same shadow that had trailed him since Linwood, since the quiet kitchen where his mother once stared into an empty corner.
Fame had given him everything, but it was beginning to take too. At the height of his power, Kevin Costner looked untouchable, but no one escapes the cost of being human. He had conquered Hollywood, but could not conquer the quiet ruins of his own heart. The world saw the confident stride, the heroic silhouette, the calm voice that could steady a storm. Yet behind closed doors, his life was splintering in ways no camera could capture. His first marriage, the one that carried him through years of poverty and obscurity, collapsed under the weight of fame. 16 years of shared struggle ended not with fireworks, but with exhaustion. Two people who had survived the hardest parts of life together, suddenly unable to survive success. The divorce shattered him in a way the public never saw. For a man who grew up fearing loss, it confirmed the darkest lesson from his childhood, that nothing precious ever stays. In the years that followed, love did not return to him gently. He fell again, tried again, hoped again, and broke again. 7 children were born into his world, from 3 different women, each a miracle he adored. But the growing distance between households, the shift from partner to ex-partner, the ache of birthdays split between lawyers and schedules, these fractures formed a map of wounds across his private life. Fame did not soften the pain. It magnified it, exposing every crack. Then came Christine. For a moment, it seemed the world had gifted Kevin one last chance at peace. She brought elegance, stability, a kind of calm he had chased for decades. Together, they raised children, built a life, created the illusion of a home untouched by the chaos of cinema. And then, almost like a cruel echo of the past, the foundation collapsed. Their divorce did not whisper, it roared. Courtroom battles, accusations, demands. A marriage that once seemed like sanctuary became a public battleground where every private wound was torn open for headlines. As Kevin walked in and out of courtrooms at nearly 70 years old, the world watched a man who had built cinematic empires lose the one thing he wanted most, a gentle ending. But life was not finished with him. As his marriage unraveled, the roles that once came easily began to slip away. Productions stalled, budgets tightened. Whispered rumors claimed he was difficult, distracted, slipping. The industry that once crowned him its role-in hero now stood at a cautious distance. His beloved project Horizon became both his lifeline and his burden, a colossal dream carried by a man already weakened by heartbreak. Night after night, in a house that felt too large and too quiet, Kevin Costner confronted the kind of loneliness fame cannot fix. Fans saw the smile, but not the way it faded when the cameras turned off. They saw the success, but not the grief that shadowed him from room to room. He had been strong for too long. He had endured too much. And the storm that now circled him, legal battles, financial strain, fading love, a career at war with time, was darker than anything he had faced before. For the first time in decades, the hero of Hollywood felt small. There are truths Kevin Costner has carried his entire life, truths that never made the headlines, never appeared in interviews, and never slipped into the characters he played, no matter how vulnerable they seemed. These truths lived beneath everything: the fame, the divorces, the triumphs, the applause. They shaped him more than any movie ever could. The first truth was born before he was. In 1953, 2 years before Kevin entered the world, his brother Mark Douglas lived for a single day, a heartbeat that flickered briefly and then vanished, leaving behind a silence that soaked into the walls of the Costner home. Kevin never met him, never held him, never heard the stories a living sibling might have told. Yet the ghost of that absence lived beside him like a twin made of shadow. He grew up watching his mother stare at corners that held memories he couldn't see, listening to his father's voice fall to a hush whenever grief brushed against the past. In that house, love was cautious, protective, wrapped in fear that life could take from them again. And Kevin, without ever intending to, carried that inherited terror into adulthood. All his life, he felt a strange, unspoken guilt, as though he was the child who survived, the one who got to breathe, to grow, to dream. And with that survival came a lifelong fear. If the universe could take a baby after one day, what else could it take? Who else could disappear? What else might slip away? It was a fear that shaped how he loved, deeply, fiercely, but always with the uneasy knowledge that love could vanish. The second truth was one he rarely admitted. Kevin Costner never believed he deserved to keep anything good for long. Every time a marriage crumbled, he blamed himself more than he ever blamed circumstance. Every time a relationship ended, he felt echoes of a loss he never personally lived, but always emotionally carried. When his 7 children were scattered across different chapters of his life, he feared, quietly, privately, that he had repeated the very fracture he had grown up inside, a family marked by absence. And then came the hardest truth of all. At 70, long after many men settle into life's gentler rhythms, Kevin was still fighting, in courtrooms, in studios, in his own heart. He confessed in rare, vulnerable moments that he sometimes felt unworthy of lasting love, a confession so raw that even those close to him rarely heard it spoken aloud. This wasn't the confession of a star. It was the confession of a boy who spent his childhood whispering goodbye to towns, to homes, to moments he barely had time to claim. Yet through all these hidden truths, one thing never changed. Kevin Costner still believes in love, even after heartbreak carved itself into the deepest parts of his life, even after silence replaced the warmth of companionship, even after courts and cameras turned his private wounds into public spectacle. He believes because he must, because if he stops believing, the foundation of his entire story collapses. And so, in his 70s, with a lifetime of scars behind him, Kevin Costner pours himself into something that outlasts every failure. His work, his stories, his legacy. Not the awards, not the films, but the emotional worlds he builds, worlds he hopes his children will one day look at and say, "That was my father. He lived with pain, but he never stopped building beauty." The hidden truth is simple, heartbreaking, and profound. Kevin Costner's greatest love story was never with a woman. It was with hope, the one thing he refused to let die. In the end, Kevin Costner's life reads less like the script of a Hollywood triumph and more like the journey of a man who kept choosing hope, even when the world gave him every reason to surrender it. He rose from rented rooms and restless childhood highways to become the steady heartbeat of American cinema. He carved stories from silence, built worlds from longing, and offered audiences a kind of honesty that felt almost ancient, the honesty of a man who knows loss intimately, yet still steps forward with open hands. At 70, he stands not as the flawless hero the world once imagined, but as something far more human, far more moving, a man who has carried every wound life gave him and still refuses to dim his light. He is the last burning torch of an older Hollywood, the era where storytelling mattered more than spectacle, where emotion mattered more than noise, where a man could speak softly and still move the world. Kevin Costner has given generations stories that healed them, guided them, reminded them. But perhaps the greatest story he ever told is the one he lived. That brokenness does not end a life, it shapes it. That loss does not steal love, it deepens it. That hope is not naive, it is necessary. If Kevin Costner's journey has ever touched you through a role, a line, or a quiet moment that felt like truth, honor him with a like, a comment, a prayer whispered into the evening. Because some legends shine brightest not when they rise, but when they endure.